Fine. If you're that good, solve this, and everything here is yours. $7 million. Cash. Including me. Claire Weston slammed the briefcase onto the conference table. The latch snapped open on impact, and stacks of $100 bills bound tight, real, countable, spilled across the polished surface and fanned out in front of Ryan Carter. The room erupted in laughter. A man in a gray janitor's uniform, dust still on his hands, had just walked uninvited into a boardroom full of executives and stated, in a calm and measured voice, that he knew how to save Weston Capital from the lawsuit that was threatening to end it. Claire looked at him not with contempt, but with something sharper. A real challenge. Ryan looked down at the money spread across the table. Then he looked back at her, steady, unhurried, without a single tremor of doubt in his face. "Fine," he said, "but I don't need your money." The room went completely silent. That silence had begun forming earlier that morning, on the 12th floor, in a corridor that smelled like floor wax and the recycled air of a building that had been sealed against a January wind. Ryan Carter had been pushing his mop cart east along the corridor at 8:43 in the morning. It was a Tuesday, indistinguishable from the Tuesday before it or the one that would follow. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency so familiar it had long since ceased to register. The wheels of the cart made their habitual squeak against the tile, a sound he had stopped hearing 3 weeks into the job. He was thinking about the route, the sequence, the quadrant of floor nearest the vending machines that always needed an extra pass because people ground whatever they dropped into the surface while they waited. The glass-walled conference room at the far end of the hall had its door pulled almost completely shut. Almost. The gap was 3, maybe 4 inches. He noticed it the way he noticed anything that varied from the usual geometry of the corridor automatically, without attaching significance to it. He was 2 feet past the door when the voices sharpened inside the room, and a word came through the gap with the clean, hard clarity of something spoken at volume. Securities fraud. Ryan stopped moving. His hands stayed on the cart handle. His eyes stayed where they were. But his mind, the part of his mind that he had spent 6 years trying to keep quiet, had already begun assembling. Because that phrase arrived with 2 others right behind it, spoken in a woman's voice that was controlled in the way voices are controlled when a person is trying not to sound afraid. Clawback provision. Then, they're taking us to court. 3 phrases, 11 words. In the way that a chord tells a musician what key a song is in, those 11 words told Ryan Carter everything he needed to understand about the shape of the problem in that room. He knew the legal framework. He knew the timing constraints. He knew the specific provisions of the SEC enforcement protocol that applied to this category of allegation. He knew, without having seen a single document, why the people inside had not solved it, because solving it required a particular combination of securities law and corporate finance that most attorneys had one of but not both, and what he was hearing through that gap told him clearly that the people in the room had neither. He stood still in the corridor for a long moment. Then he left the mop cart where it was, walked back to the conference room door, and pushed it open. Every head turned. There were 12 of them, men and women in the expensive, understated clothes of people who work in finance and have learned that appearance is its own argument. At the far end of the table, standing with one hand braced against the surface and a legal pad in the other, was the woman whose voice he had heard through the door. She was younger than he would have guessed from the sound alone, early to mid-30s, with the particular kind of composure that is not the same thing as ease. She turned last, with the deliberate restraint of someone who does not want to look startled. Ryan kept his voice level. He looked at her because she was clearly the person in the room whose opinion was the only one that mattered. "I can help," he said. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then someone near the window made a sound, then someone else. Then the laughter began, rolling around the table in stages, peaking in the middle of the room where a man in a dark blue suit found the whole thing genuinely hilarious. Claire Weston looked at Ryan Carter and did not laugh. She set down her legal pad, walked to a briefcase resting against the credenza behind her, carried it to the table, and opened it. 8 years before that Tuesday morning, Ryan Carter had occupied a particular and well-defined place in the professional landscape of financial law in Chicago. He worked at Morrison & Hark LLP, one of the 5 highest-grossing litigation firms in the city, and within that firm, he had carved out a specialty that most colleagues found too technically demanding to pursue: the intersection of securities law and corporate finance, the specific gray zone where accounting decisions become legal questions, and legal questions carry financial consequences measured in 9 or 10 figures. He had a law degree from Northwestern and a chartered financial analyst certification. He was methodical to the point that colleagues occasionally confused it for coldness. He was precise in the way that people are precise when imprecision has cost them something early and they have decided it will not cost them anything again. He was, in the parlance of his firm, the man who didn't know how to lose. He had understood this as a neutral observation at the time. He had not understood that losing could arrive through a door he had not thought to lock. In the fall of 2016, he won the case that put his name in the third paragraph of a Wall Street Journal article, Crestfield Energy, against allegations of fraudulent disclosure, $912 million in his client's favor. He shook hands across the table, filed the paperwork, went home, and made dinner, because there was already another file on his desk, and the work was the work, and it continued. Sandra left on a Thursday morning in February, when Sophia was 2 years old. There had been no escalating argument to prepare him, no distance growing slowly across months in a way that might have given him time to notice. He came downstairs at 6:45 to find a note on the kitchen table, 4 sentences on a page torn from one of his own yellow legal pads, chosen for economy rather than kindness. He read them twice, folded the note, put it in his jacket pocket, went to make Sophia's breakfast because she would be awake in 20 minutes and had a pediatrician appointment at 9, and those were the immediate facts and he was going to manage them. The collapse came later and slowly and then all at once, the way certain structures fail, holding, and then not. Over the 6 months that followed, he continued to bill hours and file briefs and appear in conference rooms and behave in every observable way like a functioning attorney, while something essential in the mechanism of his thinking ran without traction. He could see the problems. He could map their architectures with the same precision he always had. He simply could not locate in himself any reason to care about the outcomes. He sat across from clients and understood their situations completely, and felt, toward all of it, a vast and disorienting blankness that was worse than anything he had a name for. He submitted his resignation in October. He rented an apartment in Evanston, 3 blocks from Sophia's preschool, and took a facilities position at a commercial office building in the Loop, not as a punishment, but as a specific and deliberate choice. The hours were fixed. The work was physical. No one in that building knew his name or expected anything from him except clean floors and stocked supply closets. He could be done by 3:15 and at the school pickup by 3:30, and present, genuinely present, for all of the hours that were Sophia's hours. 6 years passed. Sophia grew from 2 to 8 and developed strong opinions about breakfast cereal and lost her first 2 teeth within a week of each other and joined a soccer league where she turned out to have a real and somewhat aggressive talent. He was there for all of it. He had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that being there was enough. He did not miss the law. Or if he did, he had arranged his days so thoroughly around the absence of it that the distinction had stopped feeling meaningful. He had not touched a legal file in 6 years, until the door of that conference room swung open under his hand. Back in the boardroom, the laughter was still dying when Claire Weston turned from the briefcase and looked at Ryan Carter with an expression he couldn't immediately read, not anger, not amusement, but something with both in it and something beneath both that was harder to name. "The man who doesn't need my money," she said, "is standing here wearing a name tag and holding a mop handle." She stepped closer. Not aggressively, just close enough that the conversation became, unmistakably, between the two of them alone, the room full of executives behind her reduced to background noise. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need a straight answer. Do you actually know what you're talking about?" "Yes," Ryan said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He did not look away. She turned and went back to the table, said something brief and quiet to the room, whatever it was. It settled the laughter for good, and walked out into the corridor. Ryan had already returned to his cart. He heard the door open behind him. "You said you don't need the money," Claire said to his back. "So what do you want?" He kept the cart moving forward. "I didn't say I wanted anything. I said I didn't need your money. Those are different things." She moved around him, stepping directly into the path of the cart. He stopped. She was close enough now that he could see she was younger than the CEO of a $2 billion firm was supposed to look, and that behind the composure, behind the careful management of her face, something was running very fast. "How much do you actually understand about what's happening in that room?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then, in the same even, unhurried voice he might have used to explain a maintenance schedule, he laid it out. "Securities fraud allegation, most likely a 10b-5 enforcement action. given the specific phrasing he'd caught through the door. A clawback provision triggered, which meant someone on the inside had crossed a legal threshold serious enough to activate the automatic recovery mechanism in their partnership agreement, which meant the violation wasn't theoretical anymore. It had already cost someone something measurable. A counterparty preparing to file, which meant the other side had already made the decision and was now in logistics. And the clock on all of this was shorter than she had been told. The SEC's enforcement timeline under 10b-5 did not run the way a standard civil filing did not pause for administrative delays or federal holidays, or the kind of calendar rounding that turned 19 days into 30. Whoever had given her the 30-day figure was either miscounting or managing her expectations in a way that was going to cost her more than the original problem. Claire Weston stood in the corridor of her own building, in front of the man who cleaned its floors, and said nothing for a moment that went on considerably longer than she intended. The building moved around them, people passing at either end of the hall, the hum of the elevator somewhere to the left, and neither of them moved. "Who are you?" she asked. Not rudely. The way you ask when you genuinely need to know. "Nobody, at the moment," Ryan said. "But I understand your problem." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned and went back into the conference room, spoke briefly with her assistant, and came back carrying a stack of folders that was, conservatively, 3 inches thick. She crossed the hall and put the stack in his hands. "Read all of it," she said. "I'll be in my office until 8. Come find me before you leave tonight." Ryan looked at the stack. Then at her. He took the folders without a word. He read them in the break room on the 7th floor, at a table near the window, for 2 hours without looking up. The coffee at his elbow went cold. The room emptied and refilled and emptied again. He moved through the material not page by page but in planes, building a map of the problem, rather than simply consuming facts the way he had read, in the years when reading was the beginning of something rather than the thing itself. What Marcus Hale had done, on the surface, was simple and apparently damning. Purchased shares in a Weston Capital subsidiary 3 days before Weston Capital publicly announced its acquisition of that same subsidiary. If Hale had acted on material non-public information, if he had known about the acquisition before it was public and traded on that knowledge, it was insider trading. Straightforward, serious, career-ending at minimum, and depending on scale and intent, potentially criminal. The evidentiary problem, from Weston Capital's perspective, was that the SEC had a coherent narrative with documented timing, and Marcus Hale's defense that he had been independently tracking the subsidiary for months and had acted on his own analysis was difficult to disprove without producing an alternative explanation that was equally coherent and better documented. The attorneys who had been working the file before Ryan had tried 3 different approaches to building that alternative. All 3 had run into the same wall. They could challenge the inference, but they couldn't replace it with anything cleaner. Ryan found what they had missed buried in the 6th folder, beneath a tab so nondescript it almost didn't register. A phone call, 11 minutes long, logged through the company's own internal communication system, on record whether anyone intended it to be or not, because the system logged everything and no one had thought to check whether that particular call existed. The origin was Marcus Hale's desk line. The destination was a number registered to Derek Weston, board member, Claire Weston's first cousin on her father's side, a man who had been embedded in the company's governance structure since before Claire had taken the CEO position. The call had taken place 4 days before Hale's share purchase. Ryan set the folder flat on the table and sat with his hands on either side of it for a long moment. The way you sit when something clicks into place, and you need to verify the click before you act. Because if the click was wrong, if he had read the connection into the data rather than out of it, then everything built on that click would be wrong too. He looked at the entry again. The date, the duration, the routing. It held. He stacked the folders and carried them upstairs. Claire was at her desk. The outer office was empty. The city through the windows behind her was fully dark, lit in the way that Chicago is always lit at night, not warmly, but densely and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the room. He put the folders on her desk and opened them to the right page. He placed his finger on the call log entry and left it there. "Your problem isn't Marcus Hale," he said. "Hale is the mechanism. Someone else designed the machine, someone with access to your internal systems, your board communications, and enough knowledge of your acquisition timeline to engineer a transaction that would look, on first examination, like it came from inside your own leadership." He paused. It came from Derek Weston. Claire looked at the entry. She was very still. Something moved across her face, not the clean surprise of receiving information you didn't have, but the heavier and more complex thing that comes when information you suspected becomes information you can hold in your hands and point to. Derek, she said. The word landed flat and certain, not a question. You already knew, Ryan said. I suspected, she said. She looked up at him. Her voice was steady, but there was something behind it that wasn't. I had nothing I could take anywhere, nothing specific enough. You do now, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer, took out a legal pad, uncapped a pen, and looked back at him with the focused, forward attention of someone who has just finished deciding something. Sit down, she said. Tell me what we do with it. He sat down. He told her. They worked until 11 o'clock that night, the legal pad filling up with Ryan's handwriting on one side of the desk and Claire's on the other, two people who had never worked together before, moving through a problem with the particular synchrony that comes not from familiarity, but from matching speed. The recognition, on both sides, that the person across the table was thinking at the same pace and didn't need to be waited for. What followed was not a single conversation, but many, conducted over the remaining days before the SEC examination. Ryan had no office, no title, no active law license. It had lapsed in 2021, when renewing it had seemed like maintaining a door to a room he had no intention of walking back through. He was a facilities employee with no business being involved in any of this. He was involved in all of it. Derek Weston had been working the board with the patience and precision of someone who had been building toward this for a long time. He made his case in private conversations, in the careful emphasis he placed on certain words when speaking with individual board members by phone. His argument was clean. Claire was not handling the crisis well. The decision to involve an uncredentialed outsider, a man with no active license, no formal engagement, no professional standing in any relevant field, was evidence not of resourcefulness but of desperation, perhaps diminished judgment. The board might want to consider what that meant for the company. Two members had already expressed private agreement. Ryan knew this because Claire told him. She came to his apartment the Tuesday after their initial meeting, and they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table where Sophia did her homework folders, spread between them, lamp casting a warm yellow light over the papers, and worked through the board communications line by line. By the third evening, it had become routine, the way things become routine when they are necessary, and no one has explicitly decided they will be. She came at 7, after Sophia's bedtime, and left after midnight. She was better than he had expected, not just analytically, which he had assumed, but strategically, in the way that requires understanding not just what is true, but what will be believed and by whom, and in what order. She knew when to push, and when presenting more evidence would only harden opposition. He had worked alongside litigators with twice her credentials who were not half as good at reading a room. One evening, he came back from checking on Sophia to find Claire asleep at the table, her cheek resting on her forearm, pen still loosely in one hand. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She looked younger when she was asleep, or not younger exactly, but less managed. The careful architecture of her professional presence softened into something that was simply a person resting. He was aware, standing there, of something he had not allowed himself to be particularly aware of until that moment, that this woman had been showing up to his apartment every evening for more than a week, that she had eaten his food and used his coffee maker and sat at his kitchen table until after midnight without once treating any of it as a burden, and that none of that had been required by the arrangement between them. He went to the hallway closet, took out a blanket, and draped it over her shoulders without waking her. Then he sat back down and kept working. In the morning, Sophia found them both. Ryan was at the counter making coffee. Claire was at the table, awake now and reading, blanket still around her shoulders and her hair, in a state she was very carefully not acknowledging. Sophia looked at this arrangement with the matter-of-fact assessment of a child who has learned to read rooms and has decided that what she is looking at is acceptable. She got out the bread. She made toast for 3, not 2, 3, without discussion or instruction. She placed Claire's plate at the nearest end of the table and added a glass of water without being asked, and then sat down with her own plate and ate with the businesslike focus of someone who has places to be. Claire looked at the plate. She looked at Sophia. Your dad was up early, Sophia said. It wasn't an explanation. It was a small and deliberate act of generosity, an offering of normalcy to someone who looked like they might need it. Later, After Sophia had left for school, and the coffee was done and the folders were open again, something shifted in the quality of the room. It happened in the particular way that things shift in a kitchen after a child has gone the absence of movement, the different weight of the silence. They had been working side by side for more than a week by this point, and there were things that had not been said that were beginning to occupy space anyway. Claire asked without looking up from the page she was reading, in the specific voice of someone who has been not asking something for a while and has finally decided to how long ago Sandra had left. Ryan didn't stop what he was doing. 6 years, a pause. The traffic outside moved. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. "Do you hate her?" Claire asked. He was quiet. He thought about how to answer that, not to manage her, not to perform something, but because it was actually a question worth taking seriously. He looked toward the door Sophia had gone through that morning, at the empty space it framed. The backpack that had been hanging on the hook was gone. The sneakers that were usually left beside the mat were gone. The small, constant evidence of Sophia that filled the apartment when she was in it was absent in exactly the way it was always absent when she wasn't. "No," he said. "Sophia needs me to be someone who doesn't hate her mother, so I'm not that person." He looked back at the folder in front of him. "It took a while, but I'm not." Claire was quiet for a moment. She turned the page. She read it. The way she held herself had changed slightly, something in the set of her shoulders, something in the particular quality of her attention, as though she was processing something that wasn't in the folder. "She just left," Claire said. Not a question this time, not an invitation to explain. Just the fact of it, stated flat, the way you state something when you are trying to understand the scale of it. "Yeah," Ryan said. Claire didn't ask anything else. She turned another page and kept reading. But the silence after that was a different kind of silence than the one before, the kind that exists between two people when something real has been said and acknowledged and set down carefully, and both of them understand what it is without needing to say so. Ryan's phone rang an hour later. The number was unfamiliar. He answered anyway. The voice was measured and introduced itself as Derek Weston, who had apparently decided that directness was his best remaining option. He knew who Ryan was. Derek said had done some research, understood the background, the specific combination of experience and credentials. A man with that profile was worth considerably more than his current arrangement reflected. Derek had a proposal, financially significant, more than twice anything Claire could have offered, with considerably better long-term prospects attached. Ryan listened to all of it without speaking. Then he ended the call. He sat for a moment looking at the phone. Then he called Claire. She picked up on the second ring. "Derek just called me," he said. The pause on her end lasted 3 seconds. "What did he offer?" "Doesn't matter. I'm telling you because the board is feeding him information about my involvement, which means the leak is closer to you than you thought. A beat. And because he called it all, we know something else." "What?" "He's scared, which means we're close to something that scares him." He heard her breathe. "Okay," she said. Neither of them said anything more. He ended the call and went back to the folders. The preparation for the SEC examination took the final 4 days. Ryan worked through them with a totality of concentration that compressed everything else to the edges, the same quality of focus he had carried into every major case in his previous life, the kind that feels almost impersonal, because it is not directed at winning or losing, but simply at getting it right. He built the complete evidentiary architecture, the call log timestamps cross-referenced against Hale's trading records, and the internal date on which Weston Capital's acquisition team had first documented the subsidiary deal in writing. The board communication metadata, showing the exact sequence of Derek's private outreach, the dates, the recipients, the way the narrative had been constructed and deployed board member by board member. The internal document version histories, which revealed that 2 compliance memos had been quietly edited after the fact, the changes subtle enough that no one running a routine review would have flagged them. He wrote the full argument out by hand, first a habit from his first years of practice that he had never fully set aside, then typed it and organized it into a binder for Claire's outside counsel, a woman named Patricia Reeve, who had handled Weston Capital's legal work for 9 years. Patricia looked at the binder Ryan handed her with an expression she was professionally composed enough not to put into words, but he saw it and understood it and didn't say anything about it. Ryan could not be in the examination room. His license had lapsed, and the argument that his role was merely advisory was thin enough that making it would be riskier than not. On the morning of the examination, he came directly from his shift. He was still in his gray work uniform, still with the facilities patch on the shoulder, when he sat down on the bench in the 14th floor corridor of the federal building on South Dearborn. The building smelled like institutional carpet and the particular disinfectant that federal buildings had been using for decades. People passed in both directions. No one looked at him twice. He opened the message thread with Claire. She was already inside. The examination had started at 9. He sent her the first reference point, page 7 of the binder, the timestamp discrepancy in the call log, and then sat back and waited and sent the next, and then the next. She responded with brief confirmations. 2 words, 1 word, sometimes just a single letter. But she responded every time, which told him she was reading, which told him the argument was landing, which told him to keep going. When the examiner shifted direction, as he had predicted she would, at a specific juncture in the questioning, he sent the reference for the pivot. When the line of questioning moved toward the board communication timeline, he sent page 22. When she held a position under pressure and then needed the follow-up, he sent it before she could ask. 2 hours and 47 minutes after the examination began, her message arrived. 1 word, done. He looked at the ceiling of the corridor for a moment, then the door opened. Claire came out first, with Patricia Reeve 2 steps behind her. Claire stopped in the doorway when she saw him on the bench, still in the gray uniform, still with the patch on the shoulder, sitting in the corridor the way he had been sitting for nearly 3 hours, and she walked toward him. She stopped in front of him, and he stood up. She looked at him with the particular quality of attention that comes when something resolves that has been unresolved for a long time. Something in her face was open in a way he had not seen before. She sat down next to him on the bench. Their shoulders touched. Done, she said. Done, he said. They sat there while the building moved around them, and neither of them moved. The light through the high windows was flat and gray, the particular gray of a January afternoon in Chicago, and it was quiet in the way that places are quiet when you have been through something, and you don't need to say much about it yet. The SEC redirected its inquiry toward Derek Weston and Marcus Hale within the week. Derek's quiet campaign to remove Claire from the board collapsed the moment the board received the evidence package that Claire's legal team, working from Ryan's architecture, had submitted. Derek tendered his resignation 11 days after the examination, without a statement. Marcus Hale's attorney initiated settlement discussions shortly after. The counterparty withdrew their filing. The case was over. Weston Capital stabilized. Claire resumed full authority. The news cycle moved on. Ryan went back to the 12th floor. He went back to the mop cart and the supply closet and the 7 o'clock alarm. The routine absorbed him back without ceremony or comment, the way routines do. He had not expected anything to be different. He was on the east section of the corridor, the same stretch of floor, where all of this had started when he heard footsteps that didn't fit the rhythm of the morning, not the clip pace of an executive moving through. Something slower and more deliberate. He looked up. Claire Weston was standing at the far end of the hallway. She was not in a blazer. She was wearing a dark wool coat and flat boots with her hands in her pockets, and no one walking behind her. She looked like herself in a way he had come to understand was different from the version of herself she carried into conference rooms. Ryan stopped the cart. She walked toward him and stopped close enough to talk without raising her voice. "What does Sophia like to eat?" she asked. He looked at her. "For dinner," she said. "I want to make dinner for both of you, if you want that." Something in Ryan shifted quietly, the way a door that has been stuck for a long time finally gives with only a little pressure. "Can you cook?" he asked. "No," she said, without apology, without performance. Just the simple, unvarnished fact of it. "Sophia likes pasta," he said. "Okay. 7 o'clock. She nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the elevator. He watched her go. Then he found his place on the floor and kept moving. She arrived at 6:58 with grocery bags and the immediate, unembarrassed admission that she had never made pasta from scratch and had retained about 40% of what she'd watched in 2 tutorial videos in the car. Sophia appointed herself head of kitchen operations within 90 seconds, directing Claire to the pot, specifying the water level, the amount of salt, the precise moment to taste for doneness, with the authority of someone who has strong opinions and is accustomed to having them taken seriously. Claire followed every instruction with the complete attentiveness of someone who understood she was the less experienced person in this particular domain and was not pretending otherwise. It occurred to Ryan, standing in the kitchen doorway watching them, that he had never once seen Claire Weston defer to anyone and that she managed it with a grace that told him something he hadn't known. Dinner was good. Sophia talked about soccer and the specific and ongoing injustice of her classroom's pencil borrowing policy, which she described with a level of narrative detail that suggested this was a situation she had been waiting for the right audience to explain. Claire listened with full, unhurried attention and asked questions specific enough that Sophia elaborated further, and the pencil situation turned out to be considerably more layered than it had initially appeared. After Sophia went to bed, Ryan made tea. Claire sat at the table. They didn't rush to fill the silence, and the silence did not feel like something that needed to be filled. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the January wind did what January winds do in Chicago, and neither of them was in it. 6 months after that dinner, Ryan walked into the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission and submitted his renewal documentation. He received the confirmation on a Thursday afternoon at the kitchen table, Sophia doing homework across from him. She leaned forward to read the screen when his phone buzzed, sat back, and said with crisp satisfaction, "Good," and returned to her worksheet. Claire was at the table too. She had started leaving the office earlier on days without board meetings, and his apartment was along the long way home if she chose to take it, which she had begun doing. She looked up from her laptop when Sophia spoke. She looked at Ryan. She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him said something quietly, the way things are said between people who have stopped needing to say everything out loud. Ryan took the position of Chief Compliance Officer at Weston Capital in March. He wore a suit on his first day for the first time in 6 years. Sophia inspected him in the hallway before he left, straightened his collar, took a step back, and declared him acceptable, the highest grade in her system. Claire met him in the lobby and handed him a coffee without being asked. He took it. He looked at her. "You already knew how I take it. You've been making the same coffee at that table for 6 months," she said. It wasn't a difficult pattern to notice. They went up in the elevator together. On the 12th floor, he did not look at the corridor or the place where the mop cart used to stand. He kept walking. She walked beside him. On the last Friday in April, they were eating pasta at the kitchen table, a different recipe than the first, one that Sophia had declared superior following a comparative tasting she had organized and judged herself. Sophia ate in silence for a while. Then she set down her fork and looked at Claire with the focused directness that meant she had been working up to something. "Are you staying?" she asked. The refrigerator hummed. Ryan looked across the table at Claire. Claire looked back at him, and then she looked at Sophia. And the expression on her face was the most unguarded he had ever seen, not the composed, calibrated attention she carried into boardrooms and depositions and every other arena where she had learned to manage how much of herself was visible. Just her face, open, in the lamplight of a kitchen on a Friday evening in April. "Do you want me to?" Claire asked. Sophia looked at her with the clear and uncomplicated certainty of someone who has already made her decision and is mildly surprised to be asked about it. "Yes," she said. She picked up her fork. Obviously. Claire Weston had thrown $7 million in cash onto a conference table in a moment of fury and found, in the person she had been trying to intimidate, the one individual in that room who was not looking at the money. Ryan Carter had built a life around quiet and structure, in the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday morning, and found, in the space that opened when a conference room door was not quite closed, the reason to walk back through a door he had believed was permanently shut. Sophia Carter had wanted something very simple, someone who stayed, someone present at the dinner table on Friday evenings, someone who asked about the pencil situation and actually meant it. That last part, it turned out, was the whole story. It had always been the whole story. The $7 million was just how it started.